So thank you very much. When Dominic asked me to come to this workshop, he said, I'm hoping to get 50 people along. And so I look at how many people have turned up and I think not all overruns are bad. I think Tom's introduction was very interesting, but I'm also going to set the scene in a different way. And I thought I would start with some of the public debate that we're getting at the moment, where the Governor of the Reserve Bank has been talking a lot about infrastructure. So just Tuesday this week, he pointed out that thanks to the lowest interest rates in living memory, the government can afford to borrow heavily to finance a range of spending, starting with infrastructure. So his words are such an apt introduction to what I'm going to say today that I'll give you the direct quote. He said, "This spending adds to demand in the economy, and provided the right projects are selected, it adds to the country's productive capacity. It is appropriate to be thinking about further investments in this area," meaning in infrastructure, "especially with interest rates at a record low, the economy having spare capacity, and some of our existing infrastructure struggling to cope with ongoing population growth." So I thought this quote had it all, really. Money's very, very cheap. 10-year borrowing rates for government are the lowest since Federation at 1.3%. There's room for stimulus spending, although he didn't point out that infrastructure does take time. There's spare capacity in the economy, although I know that many of you will say perhaps capacity constraints are the more binding. But what he did make sure to mention is that a lot hinges on selecting the right projects. So how hard can that be? I'm going to focus today on this question of selecting the right projects. So I'll first talk about what we've learnt about infrastructure from recent elections, and we've had 3, which is that that infrastructure is very political. I think it's becoming more so. There's not a lot of bipartisanship. And then I'll talk about the implications of this politicisation, which is what it means for government priorities, what it means for community interests, and what it means for cost overruns. So I'll start with this fact that transport infrastructure is very political. That might feel like a statement of the bleeding obvious. This slide shows you what the Commonwealth promised to different states. The two parties in the federal election promised to each state in terms of transport infrastructure. So in total, the Coalition promised to spend $42 billion and the ALP promised to spend $49 billion. The Coalition promised to spend more on roads, the Labor Party promised to spend more on public transport. That's pretty standard. What is also clear, I think, from this slide is where the spending was focused. So Victoria was the key battleground, with the Labor Party promising to spend $20 billion in Victoria alone, although a lot of that was at the last minute, a week out from the election. That's sort of the landscape of the quantum of what we're seeing promised in a federal election. But we've also had 2 state elections recently, New South Wales and Victoria, and I'll show you what happened with each of those. So starting with New South Wales, what we saw here was very big promises, particularly from the Coalition. The dollars promised are a fair bit higher at the state level than what's promised at the Commonwealth level. So the Coalition promised around $70 billion and the Labor Party $50. I think the other thing I'd point out, and following on from Dominic's comment, not only are the dollars big, but so too are the projects. So you can see that the 5 biggest projects account for easily the majority of the spending promises, and that's true for both sides. It's around 3/4 of what they're promising. So that's New South Wales. Let me show you Victoria. I'm sorry I've made the scale difference. This is slightly misleading, but if you think of the scale, this scale had to be to go higher because the Victorian promises were a lot bigger. Last November, the Coalition promised to spend $68 billion and the ALP $94 billion. We also put the Greens in here because they had a developed platform. They wanted to spend $72 billion. So the big promise here for Victoria was suburban rail loop, claimed to cost $50 billion, and the Coalition's big promise was regional fast rail at a cost of $19 billion. So one comment I'd make about New South Wales compared to Victoria is that in both cases the coalition promised around 70 billion, and the big difference is what the Labor Party promised. 50 in New South Wales, nearly 100 in Victoria. I guess to sum up what I've shown here, I think that this is one form of politicisation. These promises are absolutely enormous, and they are dominated by a few big things that I think parties hope will be seen as iconic. Another way that you can think about politicisation is how bipartisan the promises are. If the needs that these projects are addressing are so pressing and so clear, you would expect a fair degree of overlap in what the parties are promising. So how much of that did we see? Let me just show you. For the Commonwealth, so I've just picked out projects valued at $1 billion or more, of which there are plenty. So the biggest bipartisan projects here were Melbourne Airport Rail and Western Sydney Airport Rail. And other than that, it's the smaller projects. So I guess I would say this is a moderate level of bipartisanship, actually, at the Commonwealth level. Once you go to New South Wales, it is much more bipartisan here. So there's this, both major parties have committed to Sydney Metro West, Sydney Metro City, and rail to Western Sydney Airport. So 3 of the 4 biggest promises are agreed to by both parties. So I thought this was pretty unusual, actually. I was not unhappy to see this. Victoria, it's a bit more complex because I've got the Greens in here as well, but the standouts for bipartisanship are North East Link, well underway already, and Airport Rail Link. But the signature promises of the 2 major parties are different. So what you see looking at the 3 jurisdictions, I think, is that New South Wales does stand out for significantly more bipartisanship on what projects they wanted to build should they win office. So some of you might be saying, it's always been like this, it's not getting worse. And I wanted to look at this question of whether it's becoming more politicised or this is business as usual. So I'm inclined to think that it is more political for 2 reasons. So firstly, the slide I showed you for the Commonwealth election, which showed Victoria as the battleground, this, as the Victorian government does regularly point out, this is a bit of a change from recent practice. So typically, since 2005, which is as far back as I've been able to look at this, the Commonwealth has spent a lot more per capita in Queensland and New South Wales than it has in Victoria. So actually has the Victorian government spent less per capita. But the combined effect then of Commonwealth and state funding in Victoria for the previous decade has been, the usual pattern has been less spent per person, less spent per passenger vehicle kilometre, less per freight vehicle kilometre, and less per kilometre of road network. So I think fair to say Victoria has seen less than Queensland and New South Wales on kind of any of the obvious measures that you might look at. And I think the importance of this is that Victoria was seen as electorally important in the 2019 election, whereas more typically it's Queensland and New South Wales where federal elections are won and lost. So that's one reason I think that you can sort of see greater politicisation. I think the other thing that points in that direction for me is to compare the federal election that we've just had to that in 2016. So I've already indicated that the promises were bigger. Would anyone care to guess how much bigger they were this time around? 7 to 8 times bigger. Yeah, it's a lot. So this is the landscape. I'm now going to talk about why I think this matters, because you could say, surely the parties can promise what they like, particularly from opposition. It is difficult to get reasonable numbers. They can promise what they want and work it out later. So the big problem with this is that they don't work it out later. The big problem with promising projects without a realistic idea of costs is that we don't have a robust process for killing off the duds later. In reality, most projects go on to be built. So this slide shows you some results from research that I did covering the 15 years from 2000 to 2015, looking at all projects valued at 20 million or more and planned or built. So looking at the cancellation rates. And what we found is that the majority of projects that are announced with a cost attached to them do go on to be built. And in fact, 2/3 of all announced projects of that 15-year period have been built. So this has got several important implications. So in general terms, politicised decision-making matters because it distorts government priorities. So within the infrastructure pool, unrealistic cost estimates distort decisions about which particular project to invest in, this road here, that railway there. But it also distorts decision-making among all priorities, including social spending or paying down debt or reducing taxes. So systematically misrepresenting the costs of transport infrastructure projects makes them more likely to get the green light than they should be if we had a more disciplined approach. And in a way that is not true across all spending areas. So that is one reason, but more specifically, there's no particular reason to imagine that politicised decisions are well aligned with community interests. So how do we know the community's interest? We can't entirely know this, but we do have infrastructure advisory bodies, IA, IV, INSW, to help with this. So by creating long-term strategies, by assessing project proposals, by consulting with the community, and so on. And so it is, I think, one of the ways that we can form a view about alignment with community interests. And I'll show you how the projects stack up. So this is the federal election promises. And so for those of you who are not familiar with the way IA classifies projects, the projects that have been through their full assessment process, including being nationally significant and having a positive business case, are classified as projects, whether high priority or priority projects. Those that either are still in the process of being assessed, which can take a long time, or that IA has identified but there isn't yet a proponent. So at a lesser stage of development, if you like, are classified as initiatives, and they too can be high priority or priority. So what you see here is very little that's sort of been through the pipe and come out the other end in a positive way. The majority of projects are under some form of assessment, whether highly developed or not. Like there's quite a lot of projects where a proponent has yet to be identified. So some of them are really early stage. And then also quite a few projects which are either have been assessed and rejected by IA or never been submitted in the first place. So I think what I'd say about this is that neither party took a lot of notice of Infrastructure Australia's assessments. For the New South Wales election, we looked at both INSW and IA to see, because they have different roles in here, but alignment with at least one of those would be a good thing. And I think essentially you get a similar kind of story here. This is a little bit more of a positive story than at the Commonwealth level, where you do see sort of more positively assessed projects as aligning with community priorities. But I think it'd be fair to say there's room for improvement. And for Victoria, I mean, again, I think you'd say this is comparable to New South Wales. It's not terrible, but there's plenty of room for improvement. In Victoria, one of the interesting things about the election here was that a lot of the projects, they felt like announcements of the project itself, but what the parties were committing to was actually business cases. And this is how that looked once you take account of the fact that the actual commitment was to a business case. I mean, on balance, I would have thought that that's a better approach, really, to promise a business case than a project if you don't know much about the costs and benefits of the project. But whether the community gets this subtlety, I think, is another question. In any case, that's sort of what we found when we looked at it that way. I think the summary of all of this is that the independent advisors don't get heard as much as we, the community, might wish, and as much as you would expect if you listened to the political rhetoric about how important these advisory bodies are. So I've talked about distorting government priorities and alignment with community interests. There is another reason why politicised decisions are problematic, and that is that they're more prone to cost overruns. So I'll just show you a little bit about that. This slide shows you that in that 15-year period from 2000 to 2015, 3/4 of the total value of cost overruns can be explained by 1/3 of the projects which had early cost announcements. By early cost announcement, I mean that before there's a formal budget commitment, the politician will typically get up, often in an election context, and say, we're going to build this road for this many dollars. So those projects are the ones, very much driving the cost overruns. And I think what is going on here is that we, as the public, treat these cost promises seriously. So when a politician does promise to build a road or another project for a particular amount of money, that actually is the decision to invest when they do that. And you'll recall I showed you that few projects once announced get cancelled. Projects that are announced prematurely then are prone throughout their life cycle. This is one of my favourite charts, and I think what this explains, the bottom two lines show you that projects that are that come about in a more orthodox manner, so they're announced with a budget or even announced after they've got a budget, there's basically not really a problem with them. And I think that the bottom two lines explain why a lot of people said to me when I was doing this research, what are you looking at that for? We're very good at managing projects in this country. And I think you can see that for some kinds of projects that is clearly true. But if you look at the top line, the projects that are announced without any funding commitment start off life as bigger, as we've seen, and by the time they get a funding commitment, their costs on average are 25% higher than they were. But it doesn't end there. It's not like they just sort it out and then they're on a better path. They continue to get cost overrun. The budget continues to expand right through to the completion of construction, typically by another 26%. So that, I think, encapsulates the different types of projects, and these politicised projects are kind of path that they have of being sort of much more problematic throughout. And just look at the fact that they do start life as bigger. I'll just show you. This is, I'm sure, no surprise to this group that cost overruns are more common and larger among big projects. But I guess going back to my point about distorting government priorities, because the bigger projects are more prone to cost overruns than the smaller projects, the understated budget makes them systematically more likely to be chosen on the basis of an underestimate than would be the case for a smaller project. In other words, the winner's curse, that the projects that are funded are more likely to be afflicted with the curse of poor quality cost estimates than those that aren't. So I've talked to you today about the fact that infrastructure is very political, and my view that it's probably becoming more so, and also why it matters that public money is spent in this way. So I started this presentation with the words of the Governor of the RBA about the role of infrastructure in stimulating an idling economy, especially when money is so cheap. So I'm sure what I've presented today is not unknown to the Governor. He was careful to point out that it's important to select the right projects. So there's then two schools of thought about what to do about this. So one is that there are those who think that infrastructure projects decisions, selection decisions, should be made at arm's length from government by some kind of independent authority, maybe someone like Infrastructure Australia or a new branch of the Productivity Commission, something like that. And there are those who think that it's a fundamentally government job even though there might be room to improve. So I'm curious to know what you think. Can I ask for a show of hands on who thinks an independent authority would be a better way to go? And what about those who think it is fundamentally for the government to do it? Yeah, so... Right. Well, as it happens, I think it's a fundamentally government job, even though I don't like the way they do it much. Not a technocratic job. But if you think otherwise, you're in very good company, because that's what the governor thinks too. He thinks it should be like monetary policy, which 30 years ago was done within government. And now we and similar countries around the world think, it's wonderful to have an independent RBA. Anyway, I think the governor thinks that independent decision-making would give voters confidence that decisions are fit for purpose. Whatever your preferred method for achieving that, I doubt there'd be much disagreement with that goal. So thank you very much. And